Turn in your Bible, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 39. We're going to skip chapter 38 for now, and we'll come back to it when we finish the story of Joseph. Now, the reason that I want to skip chapter 38 is because I want to study the story of Joseph in a seamless manner. And chapter 38, I feel, breaks the flow of the story. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish the story of Joseph, which is going to take us all the way to the end of the book of Genesis. And then when we finish Genesis, we're not really finished, because we're going to come back to chapter 38, and we're going to talk about levirate marriage so that you'll understand a lot of the Old Testament practices, something that we're not familiar with today. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that chapter 38 is misplaced, because it's not. There's a reason why it was inserted where it is, and I'll explain the reason when we come back to chapter 38. But for now, let's just jump on ahead to chapter 39, verse number 1. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Now, there are two things that should jump out at you when you read this verse. The first one is who Joseph was sold to, and the second is the position of the man that he was sold to. Joseph was sold to Potiphar. Now, the correct pronunciation is Potiphar. But that sounds funny, and that's not the way that we pronounce it here in the South, so I'm going to continue to pronounce it Potiphar, all right? Now, Potiphar was the captain of the guard. In other words, he was the head of Pharaoh's bodyguards. So all of the palace guards were under Potiphar's command. And whenever the Pharaoh had to leave the palace, he was accompanied by military guards who were under Potiphar's command. So basically, Potiphar was responsible for the Pharaoh's safety, for security at the palace, and also, one other thing, the care of the king's prisoners. Now, that's a very, very important detail, and you'll see why a little bit further along in the story. So at the sake of being redundant, let me repeat those two things. Joseph was sold to Potiphar, and Potiphar was the captain of the guard. Very important fact. Now let's read verses 2 and 3. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. Now I want you to notice that verse 2 begins with the phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. That phrase is used 4 times in this chapter. In verse number 2, verse number 3, verse 21, and also in verse 23. But the reason it's repeated 4 times is because it's the key concept in the story of Joseph. What we're supposed to get out of this story through all of these chapters is that no matter what happened to Joseph, the Lord was always with him. And because the Lord was with him, what was meant for evil, God turned to good. Let's jump ahead and let's look at the very end of the book of Genesis. Look in Genesis chapter 50. I want you to notice what Joseph told his brothers. This is verse 20 in chapter 50. But as for you, you intended to harm me, but God turned it into good. And he brought me to this position to save the lives of many. In other words, what was meant to harm Joseph, God turned into good. Now, listen to me because this is very important. God did not cause the evil things that happened to Joseph. Let me say that again. God did not cause the evil things that happened to Joseph to happen. He was not responsible for that. Many of you have been taught that because you've been raised in Calvinist churches. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the sermon. But I want you to understand something. God did not cause the evil that happened to Joseph, but he did turn what was meant for evil into good. And that's how God works, and we need to be able to apply that to our life. Now, in verse 2, we get a glimpse of how God turned what was meant for evil into something good. First, Joseph was bought by Potiphar. And as we're going to see, this put Joseph in the right position to be noticed by Pharaoh. So in some way or another, God impressed upon Potiphar to buy Joseph as a slave. Secondly, Joseph was purchased as a house slave, not as a field worker. That's very important, because had Joseph been put into the fields, he never would have been noticed for the talent that he had. But he was put into a position that allowed him to be noticed by Potiphar. And what Potiphar noticed was that the Lord was with Joseph, and everything that he did prospered. Look at verse 2 and 3 again. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So what Potiphar did was he promoted Joseph to the position of a steward. We're going to go a little bit more in depth into that in just a second. Look at verse number 4. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he put under his authority. Now, Potiphar was a very wealthy man. And there's a reason why we know he was wealthy. The reason we know he was wealthy is because he was captain of the guard. And the captain of the guard always had to be a very wealthy man, and let me explain why. In that time period, the kings and the pharaohs had to know that the man that was over the palace guards could not be bribed. And the best way to ensure that the captain of the guard could not be bribed was by making sure that he was a very wealthy man. That way he wouldn't be tempted. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if this is true or not, but one day someone was telling me that in order to be an official for the NFL, you have to have a net worth of over $2 million. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. The person who was telling me thought that it was true. He claimed it was a fact, but he said that the reason they want that is to make sure that they can't be tempted to throw a call. Well, now with instant replay, it really doesn't matter. But anyways, I want you to understand that kings and pharaohs had to ensure that the captain of the guard could not be bribed. And for that reason, they had to be very wealthy. So Potiphar was a very wealthy man, or he couldn't have been captain of the guard. But his job also required him to spend a lot of time at the palace. So a man in his position needed a good steward, someone who could handle his property and his finances in a prudent way. So people like Potiphar were always looking for wise and prudent servants. Servants they could use to manage their property. And if one was shown to be wiser than all the rest of his servants, then that man became the master steward. In fact, you'll remember a lot of the parables that Jesus taught on referred to the master steward. Why? Because that was very common back then. So if you had a servant who seemed to be very, very wise, he was wiser than the rest, then he would be elevated to the master steward. And that's what happened to Joseph. Potiphar recognized that Joseph was wise beyond his years. He was a man of integrity, and everything he did prospered. So he put everything he owned under his authority, and that's how Joseph became the overseer of Potiphar's house, which is just another way of saying the master steward. Now, look at verses 5 and 6. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs went smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing, except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. Now you're starting to see why Jacob favored Joseph over all of his other children. The reason he favored Joseph over the rest of his children was not because he was the baby of the family. He wasn't, Benjamin was. It wasn't because Jacob was old when he was born. As I showed you last week, Jacob was only about 6 years older when he had Joseph than when he had Reuben. So he wasn't a child of his old age. That's not what that verse was saying in chapter 37. The reason he favored Joseph was because he was wise beyond his years and he had the gift of administration. So everything that Joseph touched prospered, everything. And to top it off, Joseph was a good-looking man with a great physique. In fact, he got his good looks and his good physique from his mama. If you remember, the same thing was said about her. Look back, if you would, to the book of Genesis, chapter 29, verse number 17. This is what caught Jacob's eye. Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. So Joseph took after his mama in the looks department. Now, because Joseph was smart, good-looking, and well-built, he was a chick magnet. And Potiphar's wife was attracted to him. Look at verses 7 through 9. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. But Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. Now, I want you to notice how aggressive and brazen Potiphar's wife was. She didn't try to seduce him. She didn't bat her eyes. She didn't brush up against him. She didn't say cute little things. No. She just came out and demanded that Joseph have sex with her. Look at verse number 7 again. Notice what it says. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me. She demanded. Now, of course, Joseph was a man of integrity, so he refused to do it. And he gave her 3 reasons why he would never, ever have an affair with her. Let's look at those 3 reasons. Number 1, because Potiphar trusted him, and he wasn't going to break that trust. Look at verse 8. But Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. That meant a lot to Joseph. There's not a thing that your husband doesn't trust me with. And because he trusts me, I won't break that trust. Number 2, because Potiphar was good to him, and he hadn't held anything back with the exception of her. Look at verse number 9 again. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? In other words, Potiphar had been good and kind to Joseph, and he recognized that, so he was not going to reward good with evil. He was trying to compare this to maybe sleeping with your best friend's wife. People, that's the lowest thing that you could do, is sleep with your best friend's wife, and that's what Joseph was saying. He was saying, your husband has been kind to me. I'm not going to reward his goodness with evil. And the third reason was because it would be a great sin against God. Listen to me. Adultery is not just a sin against your spouse or the spouse of the person you're having an affair with. People, it is a grievous sin against God. Let me show you something interesting. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 20, verses number 3 through 6. If you remember, Abraham was telling a half lie. He was telling everyone that Sarah was his sister, and she was kind of a half sister. And as a result of that, he was not telling people that he was married to her, and she was a beautiful woman. And so, of course, Abimelech sees her, and he wants to have her as a wife. So he brings her into his harem. But that night, this is Genesis chapter 20, verses 3 through 6. But that night, God came to Abimelech in a dream, and he told him, you're a dead man. Now, how would you like God to come to you, either in a vision or a dream, and say, you're a dead man? Because God has the power to do it. You know, if someone else comes in and they make a little threat to you, you're a dead man, it's like, yeah, sure. I'm sure you tell everyone that. But when God tells you you're a dead man, you're in trouble. So God came to Abimelech in a dream and told him, you're a dead man. For that woman you have taken is already married. But Abimelech had not yet slept with her. So he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Didn't Abraham tell me she is my sister? And she herself said, yes, he is my brother. I acted in complete innocence. My hands are clean. In the dream, God responded, yes, I know you're innocent. That's why I kept you from sinning against me and why I did not let you touch her. Now, I want you to understand, he told Abimelech this to get his attention, but the thing that he was really telling him was, if you go ahead and sleep with her after I reveal this to you, you're a dead man. But then he went further, and I want you to notice this. He said that if you touch her, you're sinning against me. God said that. You're sinning not against Abraham, not against Sarah, you're sinning against me. In other words, God considers adultery to be a sin against him. And here's what's interesting. The New Testament teaches the very same thing. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Hebrews, the 13th chapter, verse number 4. Notice what it says. Marriage should be honored by all. Not just Christians, but non-Christians. Not just believers, but unbelievers. Not just those who believe in God, but pagans. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Now, here's what's interesting. The marriage bed is actually a euphemism. A euphemism is a nice way of saying something that's not really socially acceptable. You know, we don't say that someone died, we say that they passed away, right? That's a euphemism. That's a nicer way of saying that someone died. Well, same thing with sex. We don't say someone had intercourse with them. We say they slept together. Well, the Bible does the very same thing. The phrase marriage bed is actually translated from the Greek word koite. Our English word coitus is transliterated from this word. And koite means sexual intercourse, just like our word coitus does. Now, I want you to notice what this is saying. It says that marriage should be honored by all and sexual intercourse kept pure. And then he goes a little bit further, and he kind of gives us a threat. The adulterer and all the sexually immoral, God's going to judge. Why? Because he's the one that set marriage up, and he's the one that said sexual intercourse is not a bad thing. Sexual intercourse is a good thing, but it's only to be kept inside the marriage covenant. And whenever you go outside of the marriage covenant to have sex, or you bring something outside into the marriage covenant, into the bedroom, that's adultery. And God will judge you for that because that is a sin against him. And of course, I've taught on this before. The reason it's a sin against God is because God set marriage up, or he patterned marriage after the covenant between Christ and the church. Just as Jesus Christ is the bridegroom, the church is the bride. And we become a part of Jesus through this spiritual union. When we were united with Christ, there was a breaking of his body, a shedding of blood, and we too became one spirit, not one flesh. But marriage works the same way. When two become one, and the man enters the woman, there's a breaking of the body, there's a shedding of blood, and the two become one flesh. Marriage is patterned after the covenant between Christ and the church, and sex is holy, and there's not supposed to be any type of sexual behavior outside of the marriage covenant. Period. So Joseph knew, because these stories had been passed down, that committing adultery with Potiphar's wife would be a sin against God. And that was the main reason that he told her he would never, ever sleep with her. Look back at verse number 9. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you because you're his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. So sleeping with Potiphar's wife was out of the question for Joseph. But of course, she wasn't going to let up. Temptation never stops. And those who want to do evil won't ever give up. So Joseph tried to stay away from her as much as possible. But one day, he happened to be in the house alone with her. Look at verses 11 through 15. One day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me." Now, how many of you remember the saying about a woman scorned? Do you remember how it goes? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. You know, there was a hot sauce one time that we had gone down to market in Dallas, and they have a food court there, and you get to try all of these different foods to see if you want to sell them in your store. And so they had these dips and these salsas that were there, and they had degrees of heat to them, depending on the spices. So you're going all the way down to, you have the one that says, "A lady scorned." That was the name of it. And what it said underneath it was, "Nothing is hotter than a woman scorned." Well, you know, we always say this, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Well, on that day, Potiphar's wife went beyond words, and she grabbed Joseph by his cloak, and she tried to force him to her bed. And the only way that he could get away from her was to slide out of his cloak and to run, and that's what he did. And by doing that, he scorned her touch, not just her words. Look at verse number 12 again. She came and grabbed him by his cloak. She's always been demanding, but here she's demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph had to tear himself away, but he actually left his cloak in her hand because she had grabbed him. So he didn't just scorn her words, he scorned her touch. So in anger at being scorned, she accused Joseph of trying to rape her. So she screams for help, knowing that the servants in the other parts of the house are going to hear her and come running, and those outside of the house would also hear her and come running, and hopefully they would see Joseph running away. You see, she wanted to be able to confirm that she had screamed for help. She wanted them to be able to do that, and that they had seen Joseph actually running from the house. Look at verses 13 through 15 again. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me." But I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me. And then she waited for Potiphar to come home. Look at verses 16 through 19. She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak behind." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. Now here's what's interesting. The story doesn't say that Potiphar was furious at Joseph. Did you notice that? It doesn't say that. Anyone notice that but me? In fact, you can read it in the King James Version. You can read it in the NIV. You can read it in the New American Standard, the NLT, any of the other versions. And it does not say that Potiphar was furious at Joseph. It just says that Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story. Now, most of us just assume as we're reading the story that he was furious at Joseph. And I'm sure that he was angry at Joseph, but not because he believed his wife. Let me say that again. Not because he believed his wife. He was angry that it had happened. He was angry at his wife. He was angry at Joseph that he'd put himself in that situation. You see, I know for a fact that Potiphar didn't believe his wife. I know it for a fact. And let me show you how I know that. First of all, the penalty for a slave raping a free woman in Egypt was execution, death. Always put to death, no question about it, no exceptions. So if Potiphar had believed his wife, he would have had executed Joseph. And believe me, he had the power to do that. In fact, as the captain of the guard, he was responsible for carrying out most of the executions, at least those that had to do with anything that had to do with the officials. But he didn't do that. Instead, he had Joseph imprisoned. But secondly, Potiphar didn't put him in a prison where the common criminals went. He didn't do that. Instead, Potiphar put him in a prison where the political prisoners were kept, the king's prisoners. And where was that prison? Does anyone know? It was attached to Potiphar's house. Yes. You see, the captain of the guard lived in a government house known as the palace of the captain of the guard, and it had a prison attached to it. Let me show you this. Look at verse number 20. "So he took Joseph and he threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held," not the common criminals. This prison was for the political prisoners, the king's prisoners, not common criminals. Now, look at chapter 40. We're going to jump ahead, verses 1 through 3, because this is where the king's prisoners were kept. Notice what it says. "Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended the royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials." Notice that they were officials. So he's going to put them in prison, but they're not going to go to the prison where the common criminals are. Where are they going to go? They're going to go where the king's prisoners go. They're going to go where the political prisoners go. Now, where was this prison? We'll keep reading verse 3. "And he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard." Now, where was this prison? In the palace of the captain of the guard. And who was the captain of the guard? Potiphar. Potiphar. Remember, I told you in verse 1, there's two things that should jump out at you. Who bought Joseph? And the position of the man that bought Joseph. And what was the position of the man that bought Joseph? He was captain of the guard. And verse 3 tells us where the king's prisoners were kept. This prison was at the palace of the captain of the guard. Look at verse 3 again. "And he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard." So Potiphar placed Joseph in the prison that was attached to his house. Well, actually, it was a dungeon. It had a basement. Look at Genesis chapter 40, verse number 15. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. In fact, the Hebrew word means cistern. In other words, it was rooms that were carved out of stone. So you had this palace of the captain of the guard, and underneath it were all of these cells that were carved out of the rock, and that was where he was put. So the political prisoners were kept in the dungeon at the palace of the captain of the guard. Now, if Potiphar had been furious with Joseph, he would have thrown him into the prison where all the common criminals went. Trust me, there was a big difference between the prison where the common criminals went and the political prisoners went. It's kind of like the difference between the federal prison where the white-collar prisoners go and Big Mac. Anyone know what I'm talking about? You know, I don't ever want to go to prison. Those prisoners would look at me and say, fresh meat. I'm here to tell you, I'm not ever going to have a tattoo, but if I had to go to prison, I would have one tattoo. Right back here, I would have where the tramp stamp goes, AIDS. Yeah. But hopefully, I'll never have to go to prison. But if I did, they would put me in a federal prison with white-collar people. But I want you to understand, Joseph did not go to the prison where the common criminals went. He went to the prison where the king's prisoners, the political prisoners went. And where was this prison? It wasn't out here and it was bad and hot and all the heat. Oh, no. It was down in the dungeon of the palace of the captain of the guard, because many times you might fall out of favor with the king, but you might come back into favor with the king, which we're going to see in the story, and you wanted to make sure you were in good shape. Thirdly, I'm giving you these reasons why I know for a fact he didn't believe his wife. Thirdly, the warden of the prison used Joseph as a trustee. Look at verses 21 and 22. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison, and he showed him faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think that the warden would have shown favoritism to Joseph if he thought that Potiphar hated him? Absolutely not. Remember, this prison is located at the palace of the captain of the guard, in other words, Potiphar's house, and Potiphar was his boss. There were 3 responsibilities of the captain of the guard. He was responsible for the safety of the Pharaoh. He was responsible for the guards at the palace to make sure that it was secure, the palace was, or anywhere that he went. And he was responsible for the care of the king's prisoners. That's why the prison was at his home. So Potiphar was his boss. Now, people, you don't tick off your boss. So if Potiphar was furious with Joseph and he hated him, he believed his wife, the warden would have never shown favoritism to him. But here's the kicker. This is the final straw that proves that Potiphar didn't believe his wife. Last but not least, even Potiphar continued to use Joseph's administrative gift while he was in his prison. And trust me, Potiphar would have never done that if he had hated Joseph, if he was angry with him. Look at Genesis chapter 40, verses 2 through 4. Pharaoh became angry with these 2 officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was. Where? In the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard, who's the captain of the guard? Potiphar. Assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. So who assigned them to Joseph? The captain of the guard, who was Potiphar. So let me ask you, if you truly believe that a man had tried to rape your wife, would you treat him the way that Potiphar treated Joseph? No. Let me tell you, if he came home and he felt like this foreign servant had tried to rape his wife and his wife was innocent, let me tell you, he would have had him executed immediately. But he didn't do that. If he even had a little bit of doubt, you would have sent him to the prison with the common criminals, but he didn't do that. He puts him in the prison at the palace of the captain of the guard, his home. Not only that, he probably told the warden, this guy is phenomenal, use him. And last but not least, when these 2 officials come, because he realizes Pharaoh's kind of debating on what he's going to do with these two that have fallen out of his favor. He says, give them to Joseph. He'll take good care of them. Now, a man who believed his wife, trust me, I know human nature, would not do that. That's why I say I know for a fact that Potiphar didn't believe his wife. And if you look at it, trust me, Potiphar knew what his wife was like. She had to have been flirtatious. The first time she saw Joseph and saw he was good looking and he was smart and he had a great physique, she demanded that he sleep with her. People, she was promiscuous. She was a wanton woman. But here's the problem. She made such a stink about it. Potiphar had to do something with Joseph. It was a pride thing. I mean, you either have to call your wife a liar and kick her out or you have to do something about him. So he did. But here's what I want you to see, and this is the story. This is why this phrase, the Lord was with Joseph, is mentioned 4 times in this chapter. It's because God turns what was meant for evil into good for Joseph. Now, let me ask you a question. Did God cause Potiphar's wife to accuse Joseph of rape? Did God do that? No. But God turned it into good. He took the evil that Potiphar's wife had done and he turned it into good. He used it to bring about his plan. Now, let me tell you why this is so important. This is so important because the majority of us, and I include myself, I actually went to a Bible college where all of the professors there were Calvinists. It's a Calvinist university. But the majority of us have been brought up Calvinist. And we've been taught to believe that nothing happens that's not God's will. And we will look at stories like Joseph and we'll say, look at what God did for good. Now, the reason that God could take all of the evil things that happened to Joseph and turn them into good was because Joseph never gave up. He never quit. You see, the difference between someone who has success in life and someone who doesn't have success in life isn't that bad things don't happen to the people who've had success. It's because when bad things happen, they keep on going. They don't quit. They don't give up. You see, Joseph could have given up. He had these great dreams. His brothers were going to bow down to him. His whole family was going to bow down to him. And then he gets sold into slavery. But he doesn't give up. Potiphar buys him. So he's going to do what God's called him to do. He uses his gifts. He uses his talents. He uses his abilities. He's got this gift of administration. Potiphar notices, and all of a sudden he rises to the top and he thinks, oh my gosh, I don't know how it's going to happen, but you know, one day my brothers and one day my whole family's going to bow down before him. Before he knows it, he gets falsely accused of rape, goes into the prison. He knows that Potiphar's not that angry at him or he wouldn't be where he is, but you know what? It doesn't matter. Whatever the situation, he's going to do what God's called him to do. And as a result of having that attitude, as a result of having that faith that God could do great things no matter what happened to him, God was able to take all those evil things and turn it into good. Now, as I said, many times Calvinists will point to this story and they will say, you know what? God had a plan and he used all of these things, which is true, to bring about his plan. But they'll go a step further and say God caused these things to happen. I'm going to read something. This is from Edwin Palmer. It's called The 5 Points of Calvinism. I've read this before when I taught on Calvinism, but I want you to listen to what Calvinists believe. Calvinism has 5 points. These 5 points build on each other, but they're built upon the foundation of one assumption, and that assumption is that God is sovereign. Now, we believe, those of us who aren't Calvinists, that God is sovereign, but our definition of God's sovereignty is different than a Calvinist definition of God's sovereignty. Their definition of sovereignty is that nothing happens that isn't God's will, even sin. And we don't believe that. We believe that God is sovereign, but in his sovereignty, he has given man a free will, a free choice. And because man has that free will and that free choice, evil happens. But if people pray as Jesus told us to pray, we can channel God's will into the sinful world. But you see, Calvinists believe that all the evil that's happening is actually God's will, that God is the cause of that. Let me read something to you if you don't mind. Foreordination means God's sovereign plan, whereby he decides all that is to happen in the entire universe. Nothing in this world happens by chance. God is in back of everything. He decides and he causes all things to happen that do happen. The moving of a finger, the beating of a heart, the laughter of a girl, the mistake of a typist. Now listen to this. Even sin. Oh. And my heart breaks. Let me tell you why I'm so adamant against Calvinism. You go and have to conduct a funeral service where a child has died, and you tell those parents, I don't know why, but it was God's will. God has something good in this. Let me tell you something. A parent says, if this is God and this is His will, I have a hard time not being bitter at God. But the Bible doesn't teach that God does evil. Jesus made it very clear. He says the thief comes to steal, to kill, to destroy. I've come that you might have life, that you might have life more abundantly. The epistles of John says that Jesus Christ was manifest to destroy the works of the evil one. Death is called an enemy. Yes, we're living in a sinful world, and there's a reason why God can't step in unless He's channeled in through prayer. Because once God steps in, then the end has come. We're going to see when Jesus steps in. At the end of the tribulation, Jesus steps in, and let me tell you, everything is put in order. But until that time, I want you to understand something. Sin happens, but it's not because God caused it. But the great thing about the Bible is it teaches that even though these bad things happen because we live in a sinful world and people are evil, if we keep going and believing God, He'll take those evil things and He'll turn it into good. It's not His will, but He can make good out of it because that is the type of God we serve. There was a million ways that God could have placed Joseph as the number 2 man in Egypt, put him in a position where he could have saved lives. But you know what? All these things happened because of evil, and God was there the whole time. And because Joseph never gave up, and he continued to have faith, and he continued to use his gifts, talents, and abilities, and not curse God. Remember, Job's wife tried to get Job to do that. God was able to turn those things into good. And I'm here to tell you some bad things might have happened in your life, and the devil will tell you to give up, curse God. But I'm here to tell you, if you don't curse God, if you keep going, in the midst of that horrible situation, God will be with you, and He will turn that evil into good. What was meant for bad, He will turn into good. It wasn't His will, and it isn't His will that you're in that situation, but He'll intervene in the situation.